The wrench slipped from Matthew Shaw's oil-stained fingers and clattered against the concrete floor of the garage. The metallic echo swallowed immediately by the rumble of thunder outside. He didn't bother picking it up. His hands were shaking too badly anyway, and not from the cold that seeped through the gaps in the roller door. The eviction notice in his back pocket felt like it was burning through the denim, through his skin, straight into his spine. Preparing and narrating this type of story takes a lot of time and effort. If you like the story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you want to watch every story of our channel, turn on the bell icon. 3 days. He had 3 days to come up with 2 months' rent plus late fees, or he and Emma would be on the street. Matthew pressed his palms against the hood of the 1997 Honda Civic he'd been working on since dawn, letting the cool metal ground him. The owner, Mrs. Chen from the Vietnamese restaurant 2 blocks over, needed it by tomorrow. She'd already extended her pickup time twice because Matthew kept getting pulled away by Emma's school emergencies, by the pharmacy visits, by the endless phone calls from creditors whose numbers he'd memorized by the cadence of their ringtones alone. "Dad!" Emma's voice drifted from the small office in the back corner of the garage, where Matthew had set up a card table and folding chair so she could do her homework while he worked. "Can you help me with this math problem? Give me 5 minutes, sweetheart," Matthew called back, his voice rougher than he intended. He cleared his throat, softened his tone. "Just finishing up something." The lie tasted bitter. He wasn't finishing anything. He was stalling, trying to figure out how to tell his 12-year-old daughter that they might be sleeping in the truck by Friday. The same truck that needed new brake pads and had a check engine light that had been on for 6 months. Outside, the October rain had turned from drizzle to downpour, drumming against the corrugated metal roof with increasing urgency. The garage sat on the corner of Maple and 7th, in a neighborhood that had seen better decades. The building itself had been a Texaco station back in the 80s, before the company pulled out and left behind this carcass of cracked concrete and fading yellow paint. Matthew had been renting it for 4 years now, ever since he'd left his job at Henderson's Auto and struck out on his own. Back when he'd still had hope. Back when Sarah had still been alive. He pushed that thought away like he always did, burying it under the immediate concerns, the tangible problems he could hold in his hands even if he couldn't solve them. The carburetor that needed rebuilding. The stack of invoices in the filing cabinet, most of them marked "overdue" in red ink. The lunch Emma hadn't eaten today because she'd given half her sandwich to Tyler Morrison, the kid in her class whose dad had lost his job at the bottling plant. Matthew had found the sandwich in her backpack when he'd gone searching for her permission slip for the field trip she couldn't afford to go on anyway. That was Emma, 12 years old and already trying to save the world, one half sandwich at a time. Never mind that her own world was crumbling. She had Sarah's heart, that dangerous combination of fierce compassion and stubborn optimism that made you believe you could fix things even when all the evidence suggested otherwise. Matthew had learned to stop believing in fixes. He'd learned to focus on patches, on temporary solutions, on making it through one more day. The pneumatic wrench hissed as he loosened the oil filter on Mrs. Chen's Civic. At least this job was straightforward. Oil change, new air filter, check the brake fluid. $45 that would go straight to the pharmacy for Emma's inhaler prescription. Not the rent. Not the electric bill that had a disconnect notice paperclip to it. The inhaler because Emma needed to breathe, and everything else was negotiable except that. "Dad, seriously? I don't understand number 17. Emma appeared in the doorway of the office, backlit by the fluorescent light he'd installed last year when she'd started spending her afternoons here. She was wearing the purple hoodie that was getting too small, the one she refused to let him throw away because Sarah had bought it for her 10th birthday. Her dark hair was pulled into a messy ponytail, and she had a pencil tucked behind her ear like she'd seen Matthew do with his mechanical pencils when he was sketching out engine diagrams. She looked so much like Sarah it hurt. Okay. Matthew wiped his hands on the rag hanging from his belt and walked over, leaving dark smudges on the fabric. "Let's see what's got you stumped." The math problem was about calculating percentages, something about a store discount and sales tax. Matthew explained it slowly, watching Emma's face as understanding dawned. She was smart, smarter than he'd been at her age, smarter than most of the kids in her class. Her teachers said she could probably skip a grade if they wanted, but Matthew had said no. Emma needed stability, not acceleration. She needed friends her own age and a normal childhood, or whatever approximation of normal they could manage. Got it. Emma grinned, and for a moment the worry lines that had no business being on a 12-year-old's face smoothed out. Thanks, Dad. Any time, kiddo. Matthew ruffled her hair, and she ducked away with a laugh that sounded like wind chimes, like the ones Sarah used to hang on their front porch back when they'd had a house instead of the apartment above the laundromat. Emma returned to her homework, and Matthew went back to the Civic. The rain hadn't let up. If anything, it was getting worse, the kind of storm that made the streets run like rivers and turned the potholes on Maple Street into small lakes. The kind of storm that kept customers away, because nobody wanted to drive in weather like this unless they absolutely had to, which is why Matthew almost didn't hear the car. It started as a sound that didn't belong, a high-pitched whine cutting through the rain's percussion. Then came the unmistakable sputter of an engine giving up, followed by the hiss of steam or smoke or both. Matthew straightened, listening. The sound was close, maybe right outside. He walked to the garage's roll-up door and peered through the narrow window set into it at eye level. Through the rain-streaked glass, he could make out a car pulled halfway into the lot, hazard lights blinking orange through the downpour. It was expensive, that much was obvious even through the weather and the failing light. Sleek lines, low profile. A sports car of some kind. Definitely not the usual fare that limped into his garage. And it was definitely dead. Matthew hesitated. It was past 7 o'clock. He should have closed at 6, would have closed at 6 if he weren't so behind on Mrs. Chen's Civic. Emma needed dinner, needed to finish her homework, needed to be in bed at a reasonable hour so she could catch the bus at 7:15 tomorrow morning. The responsible thing, the fatherly thing, would be to flip off the lights, lock up, pretend he hadn't seen anything. But the rain was coming down in sheets now, and whoever was in that car was stranded. Emma, stay inside. Matthew called as he hit the button to raise the garage door. The motor groaned, protesting the damp weather, but the door climbed slowly upward. Rain immediately began blowing in, carried by wind that smelled like wet asphalt and autumn leaves. The car's driver's side door opened, and a woman stepped out. Even through the rain, even in the dim light from the garage's interior, Matthew could tell she didn't belong here. She was wearing a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than his truck, and heels that were completely impractical for running through puddles. She moved quickly, though, one hand trying to shield her face from the rain, the other clutching a purse that gleamed with hardware that looked like real gold. "Is this a working garage?" she called out, her voice fighting against the storm. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but my car just died and my phone's dead and—" "It's fine, pull it in," Matthew shouted back, gesturing toward the empty bay next to Mrs. Chen's Civic. "Get out of the rain." She didn't need to be told twice. She climbed back into the car, and Matthew heard the starter motor turn over once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. The engine was completely dead. He grabbed a flashlight from his workbench and jogged out into the rain, getting soaked immediately. The water was cold enough to make him gasp. "Pop the hood," he called through the driver's window. "I'll take a look." She did, and Matthew lifted the hood, propping it open with the rod. The engine bay was pristine, not a speck of dirt or oil anywhere. This car had been maintained by people who wore clean uniforms and worked in climate-controlled dealerships. The badge on the engine cover read Porsche in silver letters. Of course it was a Porsche. Matthew shined his flashlight around, looking for obvious problems. Steam was rising from somewhere near the radiator, which meant overheating, which could mean a dozen different things. A blown hose, a failed water pump, a cracked radiator itself. He'd need to get it inside, get it on the lift, really examine it. "Can you put it in neutral?" he called to the woman. "I'll push it into the bay." She did, and Matthew put his shoulder against the door frame, his boots slipping on the wet pavement as he pushed. The car was heavier than it looked, but it rolled, slowly, into the garage. The woman steered it into the empty bay, and once it was clear of the door, Matthew hit the button to bring it back down, sealing out the storm. The sudden relative quiet was disorienting. The rain was still there, pounding on the roof, but muffled now. Matthew stood there dripping, creating a puddle on his concrete floor, very aware that he probably looked like a drowned rat. His t-shirt was plastered to his chest, his jeans heavy with water, his work boots squelching. The woman got out of the Porsche and pulled off her coat, which had protected the clothes underneath. She was younger than Matthew had initially thought, maybe late 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a bun that was starting to come loose. She wore a black dress with a white collar, simple but clearly expensive, the kind of thing Sarah used to point out in store windows when they'd go downtown for their anniversary dinners. "Thank you so much," the woman said, and her voice was different now, not fighting the storm. Smooth, educated, the kind of voice that was used to being listened to. "I'm so sorry to impose. I was on my way to the airport and the car just started overheating. The temperature gauge went red and then smoke started coming out and I panicked." "It happens," Matthew said, grabbing a cleanish rag to wipe his face. "Let me get a look at it. Might be something simple." "Is there anything not simple about Porsches?" The woman smiled, but it was strained. She kept glancing at her phone, which she'd pulled from her purse. "My flight leaves in 2 hours. I don't suppose there's any chance." She trailed off, already knowing the answer. Matthew didn't have to say it. Even if the problem was simple, a loose hose clamp, a stuck thermostat, he'd need time to diagnose it, find the parts, make the repair. 2 hours wasn't enough, especially not for a car like this. "I'm really sorry," Matthew said, and he meant it. "I can call you a tow truck, get it to a dealership in the morning. And I can call you a cab to get you to the airport if you need." No, it's fine." The woman waved her hand dismissively, but her expression suggested it wasn't fine at all. "I'll reschedule. It was just a board meeting. They'll survive without me. Just a board meeting." The casual way she said it made Matthew wonder exactly who this woman was. Board meetings weren't usually things people rescheduled lightly, but she'd said it like it was a dental appointment or a haircut. "Well, let me at least figure out what's wrong," Matthew said. "If it's something I can patch tonight, I will. No promises, but I'll try." "How much do you charge?" the woman asked, already reaching for her purse. Matthew looked at the Porsche, at the woman in her expensive dress, at the designer purse with its gold hardware. He thought about the eviction notice in his pocket, thought about the number his landlord had given him, the 2 months' rent plus late fees that added up to more money than Matthew usually made in a good month, let alone a terrible one. He thought about Emma in the back office, doing her homework at a card table because they couldn't afford a real desk. And he thought about Sarah, and what she would have said if she'd been here. Sarah, who'd always insisted on paying it forward, on helping people even when, especially when, they couldn't afford to. Sarah, who'd packed lunches for the homeless guys who slept under the bridge near her nursing route. Sarah, who'd taught Emma that kindness wasn't something you gave only when it was convenient. "Nothing," Matthew heard himself say. "This one's on the house." The woman's eyes widened. "What? No, I couldn't possibly." "It's fine," Matthew said, cutting her off before he could change his mind. "You're stranded in a storm. I'm not going to charge you for basic human decency. Let me take a look, and we'll go from there." The woman stared at him for a long moment, and Matthew couldn't quite read her expression. Surprise, definitely. Something else, too. Calculation, maybe, or assessment, like she was trying to figure out what his angle was. People like her probably thought everyone had an angle. "Thank you," she said finally, and her voice had softened in a way that made her sound almost vulnerable. "That's incredibly kind. I'm Victoria Ashford, by the way." She held out her hand, and Matthew shook it, leaving a smudge of oil on her palm that she didn't seem to notice or care about. "Matthew Shaw," he said. "Give me a few minutes to look under the hood properly." He went to work, positioning his work light over the engine bay, really examining the components now that he had time and visibility. Victoria, and wasn't that a name that belonged in magazines and penthouse apartments, stood back, watching him work with an intensity that made him self-conscious. "Dad, is everything okay?" Emma appeared again, curious as always. She stopped when she saw Victoria, suddenly shy in the way she got around strangers, especially well-dressed ones. "Oh, sorry. It's fine, sweetheart. This is Ms. Ashford. Her car broke down." Matthew didn't look up from the engine, his fingers tracing the path of the upper radiator hose. "Ms. Ashford, this is my daughter Emma." "Hello, Emma," Victoria said, and her voice changed again, warming. "You're doing homework?" Emma nodded. "Math is super boring." "Math is never boring," Victoria said, and she sounded almost offended. "Math is how you build skyscrapers and design bridges and calculate profit margins. Math is power." Emma considered this, her head tilting the way it did when she was really thinking about something. "I guess when you put it like that, it sounds cooler." Victoria laughed, a sound that seemed surprised out of her. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" "A veterinarian," Emma said without hesitation. "I want to help animals." "That's a wonderful goal," Victoria said. "You know what you need to be a veterinarian? Math, biology, chemistry, all of it." Matthew found the problem. The lower radiator hose had split along a seam, probably from age and pressure. Coolant had been spraying out, which explained the overheating and the steam. It was a simple fix, relatively speaking, but it required a part he didn't have in stock. He'd need to either call around to find one, unlikely at this hour, or order one online and wait for delivery. "Found it," Matthew said, straightening up. "Blown radiator hose. I can replace it, but I don't have the part here. I can order one tonight. Might be able to get it by tomorrow afternoon if I pay for rush shipping." "Tomorrow afternoon," Victoria repeated, and she glanced at her phone again. "Right, of course." "I'm sorry I can't fix it tonight," Matthew said, and he was. Not just because she'd miss her flight, but because he'd said he'd try, and he hated making promises he couldn't keep. "No, you've been incredibly helpful," Victoria said quickly. "Really, most places wouldn't have even let me pull in. Can I use your restroom? And maybe borrow your phone to call a car service?" "Of course." Matthew pointed toward the small bathroom in the corner, next to the office. "Phone's on the desk in there. Help yourself." While Victoria made her call, Matthew explained the problem to Emma, showing her the split hose, explaining how the cooling system worked. Emma listened with the same intensity she brought to everything, asking questions that showed she was really paying attention, not just being polite. Victoria emerged from the office, looking slightly less composed than before. "The car service can't get here for 45 minutes, she said. "The storm has everything backed up." "I'm so sorry to keep imposing." "Stop apologizing," Matthew said. "You're not imposing. Emma and I were just going to grab some dinner anyway. You're welcome to wait here where it's dry." "Dinner," Victoria repeated, like the word was foreign. She checked her phone again, then seemed to make a decision. "What if I bought us all dinner, as a thank you for your help? There must be somewhere nearby that delivers." Matthew thought about the $15 in his wallet, the $5 in quarters in his truck's cup holder. He thought about the can of soup he'd been planning to heat up on the hot plate in the office, the sleeve of crackers they'd share. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know I don't have to," Victoria said. "I want to. Please, let me do something to say thank you, since you won't let me pay you for your time." Emma was looking at Matthew with hopeful eyes. How long had it been since they'd had real restaurant food? 2 months? 3? "Okay," Matthew said. "If you're sure." "I'm sure," Victoria said. "What's good around here?" The pizza arrived 30 minutes later, delivered by a teenager Matthew recognized from the neighborhood, Danny Rodriguez's youngest son. The kid's eyes went wide when he saw the Porsche in the bay, and wider still when Victoria handed him a $50 bill for a $28 order and told him to keep the change. They ate in the office because it was the only space with chairs. Matthew pulled in his rolling stool from the garage while Victoria and Emma sat at the card table. The pizza box opened between them. It was from Angelo's, the Italian place on 4th Street that Matthew passed every day but never went into. The pizza was loaded with toppings, the real kind, not the sparse scattering you got from the budget chains. Emma ate like she'd never seen food before, which made Matthew's chest tight with shame and love in equal measure. "This is really good," Emma said around a mouthful of pepperoni and mushroom. "Dad usually makes grilled cheese for dinner." "I like grilled cheese," Victoria said, but she was smiling. My mother used to make it for me when I was your age. She'd cut it into triangles and serve it with tomato soup. That's fancy grilled cheese, Emma said seriously. We just do rectangles. Matthew wanted to disappear into the floor, but Victoria just laughed. That surprised sound again, like she wasn't used to laughing but kept finding reasons to. Rectangles are classic, Victoria said. Never underestimate the power of classics. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the rain still drumming overhead but feeling distant now, shut out by pizza and unexpected company. Matthew watched Victoria when he thought she wasn't looking. She ate carefully, dabbing her mouth with a napkin between bites, but there was nothing pretentious about it. Just habits built over a lifetime of different circumstances than his. So, Emma said, because Emma had never met a silence she couldn't fill with questions. What do you do? For work, I mean, are you like a lawyer or something? Emma, Matthew said. That's rude. It's fine, Victoria said. I'm a businesswoman. I run a company that makes medical devices. Things like insulin pumps and heart monitors. Emma's eyes lit up. That's so cool. You help sick people. In a way, Victoria said. I help make the tools that doctors use to help sick people. It's not quite as hands-on as being a veterinarian, but it matters. Dad says everything matters if you do it right, Emma said. He says it doesn't matter if you're a mechanic or a doctor, as long as you care about doing it well. Victoria looked at Matthew, and there was something in her gaze he couldn't quite name. Your dad sounds very wise. Matthew felt heat rise in his cheeks. I just try to teach her that honest work is nothing to be ashamed of. Honest work? Victoria repeated softly, like she was testing the phrase. That's a good way to put it. Emma finished her third slice and wiped her hands on a napkin. Can I go back to my homework? I want to finish before we go home. Go ahead, kiddo, Matthew said. I'll clean up here. Emma retreated to her corner of the office, leaving Matthew and Victoria alone with the pizza box and the sound of rain. Matthew started gathering up the paper plates, but Victoria stopped him with a hand on his wrist. Let me ask you something, she said, and I want you to be honest with me. Why did you really say you wouldn't charge me? I saw the stack of bills on your desk. I saw the eviction notice sticking out of your pocket. Matthew froze. He'd forgotten about the notice, forgotten it was visible. Shame burned through him, hot and immediate. That's none of your business. You're right. It's not, Victoria said. But she didn't let go of his wrist. But I'm asking anyway, because in my experience, when someone gives something away for free when they clearly need the money, there's always a reason. So what's yours? Matthew pulled his hand away and stood up, needing to move, needing distance. He walked to the garage door, looking out through the window at the rain-soaked street. The streetlight on the corner was flickering, throwing uneven shadows across the puddles. My wife died 3 years ago, he said finally, his voice flat. Cancer. Stage 4 pancreatic, diagnosed too late to do anything but make her comfortable at the end. She was a nurse, spent her whole life taking care of other people, and when it was her turn to need care, we couldn't afford the treatments that might have bought her more time. Not the experimental ones, not the ones insurance wouldn't cover. He heard Victoria's sharp intake of breath but didn't turn around. She made me promise something before she died. Made me promise that I wouldn't let what happened to us make me hard. That I'd keep being kind, keep helping people, keep teaching Emma that the world is full of good things if you look for them. Even when it feels like the world is taking everything from you. Matthew pressed his forehead against the cool glass. So when you pulled up in your expensive car and your expensive clothes, stranded in the rain, I thought about Sarah. And I thought about what she'd want me to do. And it sure as hell wasn't charge you $200 for looking at a radiator hose. The silence stretched out between them, broken only by the scratch of Emma's pencil in the corner and the endless rain. Matthew felt exposed, raw, like he'd opened up his chest and shown Victoria all the broken parts he usually kept hidden. I'm sorry, Victoria said finally. About your wife. That's not fair. What happened to you? Life isn't fair, Matthew said, and he couldn't keep the bitterness out of his voice. That's just how it is. It doesn't have to be. Matthew turned around. Victoria was standing now, her arms crossed, her expression intense in a way that made her look different. Harder, maybe, or just more focused. "What's that supposed to mean?" Matthew asked. "It means that I came here tonight thinking I was having the worst day," Victoria said. "My board is trying to oust me from my own company. I've been fighting them for 6 months, and I'm losing. They want to bring in someone who'll prioritize profits over patients, someone who'll cut corners on safety testing to get products to market faster. I was flying to New York to try to save everything I've built, and I was feeling very sorry for myself." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "And then my car died, and a man who has every reason to be bitter and angry and selfish fixed it for free, fed me and his daughter pizza, told me about his dead wife and somehow made it sound like a lesson about kindness instead of a tragedy." Victoria walked closer, her heels clicking on the concrete floor. "So I'm going to ask you something, Matthew Shaw, and I want you to really think about your answer. What would you do if you had enough money? Not to be rich, not to be comfortable, but just to be okay. What would you do?" Matthew stared at her. The question felt like a trap, but he couldn't see the teeth of it. "I'd get us out of that apartment," he said slowly. "The one above the laundromat that smells like fabric softener and has mold in the bathroom. I'd find a place with a yard where Emma could play, with a decent school district so she could have the education she deserves." He was warming to it now, the fantasy of it, even though it hurt to want things he couldn't have. "I'd fix up this garage properly, get new equipment, hire some help so I could actually keep regular hours. Build a real client base instead of just taking whatever jobs I can get. I'd put money away for Emma's college," he continued, his voice getting stronger. "Sarah wanted her to go to college, to have opportunities we never had. I'd make sure that happened, no matter what. And I'd stop lying awake at night doing math in my head," Matthew said, the words tumbling out now. "Stop calculating how many more months we can last if I work 7 days a week. Stop choosing between Emma's medicine and the electric bill. Stop feeling like I'm failing her every single day." He stopped, breathless, shocked by his own honesty. Victoria was watching him with an expression he still couldn't read. "Okay," she said. "Then let's make that happen." Matthew laughed, and it came out harsh. "What, you're going to write me a check? That's not how this works. I don't take charity." "Not charity," Victoria said. "Investment. I'm going to offer you something, and I want you to hear me out before you say no. Ms. Ashford." "Victoria, and just listen." She took a breath. "I need someone I can trust. Someone who understands what it means to work with your hands, to build things that matter, to care about the details. Someone who knows that the cheapest solution isn't always the best one, that quality matters, that people matter." "I don't understand," Matthew said. "My company, Ashford Medical, we manufacture components for hospitals. Surgical equipment, monitoring devices, diagnostic tools. We have a manufacturing facility about 30 miles from here, and it's been having problems. Safety violations, quality control issues, workers getting hurt because the equipment isn't maintained properly. The plant manager keeps telling me everything is fine, but I don't believe him." Victoria moved closer. "I need someone to go in there and audit the facility. Someone who knows machines, who can tell me the truth about what's really happening. Someone who can't be bought or intimidated. And then, if you're willing, I want you to help me fix it. Properly. The right way." Matthew felt like the ground had shifted under his feet. "You want to hire me? To do what, exactly?" "Consult," Victoria said. "Analyze. Report. And if we can work together, maybe something more permanent. I need people in my company who remember what it's like to struggle, who won't sacrifice safety for speed. You'd be paid, obviously. Consultants make good money, Matthew." "How much money?" The question felt crass, but he needed to know if this was real or just a fever dream brought on by too much stress and not enough sleep. Victoria named a figure that made Matthew's knees weak. It was more than he made in 6 months. "For one job." "That's insane," he said. "I'm a mechanic. I barely finished high school. I don't know anything about medical manufacturing or corporate consulting or—" "You know about machines," Victoria interrupted. You know about maintenance and safety and what happens when people cut corners. You know about integrity, which is something that's in short supply in my world. That's what I need. Matthew looked over at Emma, who was absorbed in her homework, her pencil moving steadily across the page. Emma, who deserved so much more than he'd been able to give her. Emma, who was 12 years old and already knew how to ration food and turn off lights to save electricity, and lie to her friends about why she couldn't afford new clothes. "Why me?" he asked. "You could hire any actual consultant in the country. Why would you trust a stranger you met when your car broke down?" "Because you fed me pizza when you couldn't afford it," Victoria said simply. "Because you helped me for free when you needed the money desperately. Because your daughter talks about math like it's boring but her eyes lit up when I told her it was power. Because you promised your dying wife you'd stay kind." She held out her hand. "Because I think you're the kind of person who won't lie to me about what he finds, even if the truth is uncomfortable. And that's worth more than any credential." Matthew looked at her hand, at the offer hanging in the air between them. It felt too good to be true, felt like the kind of thing that would crumble the moment he touched it. But Emma needed new shoes. The rent was due, and Sarah had made him promise not to let the world make him hard. Maybe this was the universe's way of keeping that promise. He took Victoria's hand and shook it. "Okay," he said. "I'll do it. But I want everything in writing. Contract, payment terms, all of it. I'm not naive enough to do this on a handshake." Victoria smiled, and it transformed her face. "I wouldn't respect you if you were. I'll have my lawyer draw up a contract tonight. You can review it with your own lawyer before you sign." "I don't have a lawyer." "You do now," Victoria said. "I'll arrange for one. Independent, your choice from a list. No strings. This has to be fair, Matthew, or it doesn't work for either of us." The car service arrived 20 minutes later. Victoria gathered her coat and her purse, pausing at the door to look back at the garage, at Matthew and Emma, at the Porsche still sitting dead in the bay. "I'll have someone come pick up the car tomorrow," she said. "Order the part you need, fix it properly. Bill me for everything, including your time, and I'll send that contract over by noon tomorrow." "You're serious about this?" Matthew said, still half convinced he'd wake up and find it had all been a storm-induced hallucination. "I'm always serious about business," Victoria said. "And Matthew, thank you for everything. You reminded me why I started Ashford Medical in the first place. I'd forgotten." She left, and Matthew stood in the garage doorway, watching the car service pull away, its taillights disappearing into the rain. Emma came to stand beside him, slipping her small hand into his. "She was nice," Emma said. "Is she really going to give you a job?" "Maybe," Matthew said, not wanting to get her hopes up, not wanting to get his own hopes up. "We'll see." But that night, after he'd locked up the garage and driven Emma home to their small apartment that smelled like fabric softener and broken dreams, after he'd tucked her into bed and kissed her forehead and told her he loved her, Matthew pulled out the eviction notice and looked at it. 3 days to come up with the money. But maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't need to. He fell asleep that night with his phone on his chest, waiting for it to ring, waiting for Victoria to tell him it had all been a mistake, that she'd changed her mind, that people like him didn't get offers like that. But when his phone finally did buzz at 7 the next morning, it wasn't Victoria calling to take it back. It was an email from a law firm downtown with a contract attached. A contract that had his name on it, Matthew Shaw, listed as independent safety consultant for Ashford Medical Technologies. The payment terms were exactly what Victoria had promised. The scope of work was clear and detailed, and at the bottom was a clause that made his breath catch. Upon successful completion of initial audit, potential for permanent position as Director of Quality Assurance and Safety Compliance. Director, a title that came with a salary Matthew couldn't even let himself imagine. He read the contract 3 times before Emma woke up, before he had to start the morning routine of breakfast and backpack checks and making sure she had lunch money. He read it again while she brushed her teeth, memorizing the words, looking for the catch. There had to be a catch. Things like this didn't happen to people like him. But the contract seemed solid. Fair. Real. "Dad," Emma called from the bathroom. "Can you braid my hair today?" "Yeah. Sweetheart, Coming, Matthew called back. He set the phone down and went to help his daughter get ready for school, pushing thoughts of contracts and consultancies and impossible offers to the back of his mind. Because right now, Emma needed her hair braided and her lunch packed and her father to tell her she was going to do great on her math quiz. The rest could wait. But as he worked his fingers through Emma's dark hair, creating the simple braid Sarah had taught him in the early days of Emma's diagnosis, when the chemo had made her scalp tender and regular brushing hurt too much, Matthew let himself feel something he hadn't allowed in a long time. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were going to change. Maybe the universe was finally done taking from him and ready to give something back. Maybe Sarah had been right all along and kindness wasn't just a virtue but an investment that paid dividends in unexpected ways. The braid came out crooked, like it always did, but Emma didn't complain. She just smiled at him in the mirror and said, "Thanks, Dad," and grabbed her backpack with the broken zipper that he'd been meaning to replace for 3 months. Matthew drove her to school in the truck that needed brake pads, listening to her chatter about the science project she was planning, something involving plant growth and different types of soil. She wanted to prove that you didn't need expensive fertilizer to grow healthy plants, that sometimes the simplest solutions were the best ones. She sounded so much like Sarah when she talked like that, full of conviction and optimism and that unshakable belief that problems had solutions if you just looked hard enough. "Love you, kiddo," Matthew said as she climbed out at the curb in front of Riverside Middle School. "Have a good day." "Love you too, Dad," Emma called back, already running toward a group of her friends near the entrance. Matthew watched until she disappeared inside, the way he always did, because you never knew what might happen and he couldn't shake the superstition that if he didn't watch her all the way in, something bad would occur. 3 years of hypervigilance had left marks he wasn't sure would ever fade. He drove back to the garage through streets that looked different in daylight, less threatening than they had in last night's storm. The sun was trying to break through the clouds, casting pale light on the puddles that reflected the sky. The Porsche was still in the bay where they'd left it, looking out of place among the older vehicles that usually occupied his space. Matthew spent the morning on the phone with parts suppliers, trying to track down the radiator hose he needed. The Porsche wasn't a common model around here, and most local shops didn't stock parts for luxury vehicles. He finally found one at a dealership 40 miles away, and they agreed to courier it over for an extra fee that made Matthew wince even though Victoria had said to bill her for everything. While he waited for the part to arrive, he worked on Mrs. Chen's Civic, finishing the oil change and replacing the air filter. He was adjusting the idle speed when his phone rang. Unknown number, but Matthew answered it anyway because you never knew when a customer might be calling. Matthew Shaw, a woman's voice, professional and crisp. Speaking. "This is Rebecca Martinez from Hartwell and Associates. Ms. Ashford asked me to call you regarding the contract she sent this morning. Have you had a chance to review it?" Matthew's pulse quickened. "I read it, yeah. Looks comprehensive. Good. Ms. Ashford wanted me to make clear that I work for you in this matter, not for her. My job is to make sure your interests are protected and that you understand everything you're signing. Do you have time this afternoon to meet? I'm happy to come to your location." The idea of a lawyer coming to his garage felt surreal, but Matthew agreed. They set a time for 2 o'clock, after Emma got out of school, so she could stay with Mrs. Chen at the restaurant while he handled business. The radiator hose arrived just before noon, and Matthew installed it carefully, taking his time to make sure everything was sealed properly. He refilled the coolant, checked for leaks, let the engine run through a full heat cycle. The Porsche purred like it had never had a problem, the kind of sound that came from German engineering and precision manufacturing. Matthew found himself admiring the car despite his general skepticism about luxury vehicles. There was something honest about the way it was built, no shortcuts or compromises, every component exactly what it needed to be. It reminded him of Victoria somehow, that sense of purpose beneath the expensive exterior. He was detailing the invoice when Mrs. Chen arrived to pick up her Civic. She was in her 60s, small and sharp-eyed, and she looked at the Porsche with undisguised curiosity. "You move up in the world, Matthew?" she asked, handing him cash for the oil change. "Not mine," Matthew said. "Customer from last night. Broke down in the storm." Mrs. Chen counted out the bills, then added an extra 20. For Emma. Buy her something nice. Mrs. Chen, I can't. You can and you will, Mrs. Chen said firmly. Your wife used to help my daughter with her nursing school homework. Never asked for anything. This is how we pay it forward, yes. We help each other. Matthew's throat tightened. He took the money, knowing that refusing would insult her, understanding that this was about more than cash. It was about community, about the web of small kindnesses that kept people afloat when the world tried to drown them. Thank you, he said quietly. Mrs. Chen patted his hand. You're a good man, Matthew Shaw. Good things come to good people. You wait and see. She drove away in her Civic, and Matthew stood there holding the extra $20, wondering if Mrs. Chen was right or if she was just being kind. In his experience, good things came to people who were lucky, and luck wasn't something he'd had much of lately. But then again, Victoria Ashford's car had broken down right outside his garage in the middle of a storm. If that wasn't luck, what was it? Rebecca Martinez arrived at exactly 2 o'clock in a silver sedan that was practical but well-maintained, the kind of car that suggested competence without flash. She was younger than Matthew had expected, maybe early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and glasses that kept sliding down her nose. Mr. Shaw. She held out her hand, and Matthew shook it, very aware of the oil still embedded under his fingernails no matter how hard he scrubbed. Rebecca Martinez. Thanks for taking the time to meet with me. They sat in the office, Rebecca at the card table where Emma did her homework, Matthew on his rolling stool. Rebecca pulled out a laptop and a printed copy of the contract, both of which she spread between them. Okay, she said. Let's go through this section by section. I want to make sure you understand what you're agreeing to and what protections you have. For the next hour, Rebecca walked Matthew through every clause, every term, every potential implication. She explained things in plain language, without the condescension he'd half expected from a lawyer. When she found clauses that could be improved, a tighter definition of working hours here, a clearer termination policy there, she made notes and promised to negotiate changes. The core offer is solid, Rebecca said finally. Ms. Ashford is offering you $10,000 for the initial audit, which should take approximately 2 weeks of full-time work. She'll cover your expenses, including any childcare costs for Emma while you're at the facility. And she's offering you first right of refusal on the permanent position if your audit leads to her making changes in the company. $10,000. Matthew had never had that much money at one time in his entire life. Even when Sarah was alive and they'd both been working, even before the medical bills started piling up, $10,000 had been a theoretical concept, not a real possibility. What's the catch? Matthew asked. There has to be a catch. Rebecca looked at him over her glasses. The catch is that you have to be honest in your findings. If you go into that facility and discover that everything is fine, that the plant manager is doing his job and the safety concerns are overblown, you have to say so. Even if it means losing the permanent position. Even if it means disappointing Ms. Ashford. And if I find problems, then you document them thoroughly, professionally, and without bias. You provide recommendations for improvement. You work with Ms. Ashford's team to implement changes. And you do it all while maintaining your integrity. Rebecca leaned forward. Ms. Ashford has a reputation in the business community. She's known for being demanding but fair, for expecting excellence but compensating it appropriately. She doesn't make offers like this lightly. If she thinks you're the right person for this job, you probably are. Matthew wanted to believe that. Wanted to believe that someone with Victoria's resources and experience could see something in him worth investing in. But doubt was a habit he'd cultivated over 3 years of loss and struggle, and habits were hard to break. What if I mess it up? He asked quietly. What if I don't know enough? Don't see the right things? Miss something important? Then you ask questions, Rebecca said simply. You bring in experts where you need them. You admit what you don't know and learn. That's not failure, Mr. Shaw. That's professionalism. She closed her laptop and gathered up her papers. I'm going to recommend some minor changes to the contract. Ms. Ashford's legal team will review them and will have a final version by tomorrow morning. But unless you have serious objections, I'd advise you to sign it. This is a good opportunity. After Rebecca left, Matthew sat in the quiet garage, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood outside. Traffic on Maple Street. Kids playing in the vacant lot 2 blocks over. The distant wail of a siren heading toward downtown. Normal sounds. Everyday sounds. The soundtrack of a life that was about to change. He picked up his phone and called the number Victoria had given him. She answered on the second ring. Matthew, I was hoping you'd call. Did you meet with Rebecca? Yeah, Matthew said. She's making some changes to the contract, but she says it's solid. Said I should sign it. Are you going to? Matthew looked around the garage. At the tools he'd collected over years of scraping together money for the good brands, the reliable ones. At the lift he'd bought used from Henderson's when they'd upgraded their equipment. At the pegboard where he'd organized everything exactly the way he needed it, every wrench and socket in its place. He'd built this from nothing. Built a life for Emma from the wreckage of Sarah's death. Done it alone, without help, without handouts, without taking the easy way. But maybe it was okay to accept help. Maybe that wasn't weakness but wisdom. Yeah, he said. I'm going to sign it. When do you want me to start? Monday, Victoria said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. That gives you the rest of the week to arrange things here. Make sure your existing customers are taken care of. I'll have someone pick up my car tomorrow. Tell me what I owe you for the repair. Matthew calculated quickly. Parts, labor, the courier fee for rush delivery. $340. That's all. Victoria sounded skeptical. I don't overcharge, even for Porsches, Matthew said. That's the fair price. Then add your time from last night. Diagnosing the problem. Letting me wait here, all of it. That was free. I already told you. Matthew. Victoria's voice was firm but not unkind. You're a consultant now. Your time has value. Bill me appropriately or I'll be insulted. Matthew sighed. Fine. $500 total. Thank you. I'll have someone drop off a check tomorrow with the car pickup. She paused. And Matthew? I meant what I said last night. You reminded me why I do this work. Why it matters. Thank you for that. The call ended, and Matthew sat there holding his phone, feeling like he'd just stepped off a cliff and discovered he could fly. Emma was excited when he told her that night over dinner. Actual dinner that he'd picked up from the grocery store, chicken and vegetables that he'd cooked in their tiny kitchen. She peppered him with questions about the job, about what he'd be doing, about whether this meant they could stay in the apartment. It means we're going to be okay, Matthew said, not wanting to promise too much too soon. It means things are looking up. Can we get a dog? Emma asked, because of course that's where her mind went. If we're going to be okay? Let's take it one step at a time, Matthew said, but he was smiling. Maybe. That night, after Emma was asleep, Matthew sat at the kitchen table with a calculator and a notebook, doing something he hadn't allowed himself to do in years. Planning for a future that wasn't just about survival. The $10,000 from the audit would cover the back rent, the late fees, the electric bill, the pharmacy, and still leave enough to start building an emergency fund. If he got the permanent position, and that was still a big if, the salary Victoria had mentioned would mean Emma could have new clothes, could go on that field trip, could stop giving half her lunch to Tyler Morrison because they'd have enough for both of them. It meant Matthew could stop working 7 days a week, could spend real time with his daughter, could maybe even take her on a vacation someday. When was the last time they'd done something just for fun? Not since Sarah died. Not since their world had contracted to the size of rent checks and medical bills. Matthew thought about Sarah, about the promise he'd made her, about staying kind even when the world took everything, about teaching Emma that compassion mattered more than money. He hoped she could see this somehow wherever she was, hoped she knew that he'd kept his promise, that the kindness she'd insisted on had maybe, finally, paid off in a way that would let him take care of their daughter properly. I miss you, he whispered to the empty kitchen. God, I miss you every day. But for the first time in 3 years, the missing felt like something he could carry instead of something that was crushing him. For the first time in 3 years, Matthew Shaw went to bed without doing math in his head about how many more months they could last. He went to bed thinking about possibilities. Life has a peculiar way of testing us when we least expect it. For Matthew Shaw, a widowed mechanic struggling to keep his world together, that test arrived on an ordinary Monday morning in October, disguised as an opportunity that seemed too good to be true. Matthew Shaw wasn't living the American dream, he was barely surviving it. 3 years after losing his wife Sarah to cancer, he found himself treading water in a sea of responsibilities that never seemed to recede. As the sole proprietor of a struggling auto repair shop on Maple Street and the single father to 10-year-old Emma, Matthew's days blurred together in an exhausting cycle of work, worry, and the constant calculation of which bills could wait another week. His garage, once a thriving business, had become a monument to deferred maintenance and diminishing returns. The roof leaked when it rained. The lift needed repairs he couldn't afford. Customers were few and far between in a neighborhood where most people were just as broke as he was. But Matthew kept showing up, kept fixing cars, kept doing honest work for honest pay, even when honesty didn't pay nearly enough. Emma, bright and resilient beyond her years, deserved so much more than the hand-me-down clothes and the apartment where the heat worked sporadically. She deserved stability, opportunity, a childhood that wasn't defined by scarcity. Matthew saw it in her eyes every time she pretended not to want something, every time she assured him that the school field trip wasn't that important, every time she acted older than her years because she'd learned that being a burden made things harder. The weight of failing her crushed him a little more each day. Enter Victoria Ashford, a woman who existed in a world Matthew could barely imagine. Wealthy, powerful, poised, she was the heir to Ashford Medical, a medical device manufacturing empire. Their paths crossed through an act of kindness so small that Matthew thought nothing of it. Helping her when her luxury car broke down, refusing payment because that's just what decent people did. But Victoria noticed. In a world where everyone wanted something from her, where business relationships were transactional and trust was a commodity to be purchased, Matthew's simple decency stood out like a beacon. Her offer was staggering: $10,000 for a week of consulting work. She needed someone to audit one of her manufacturing facilities. Someone with mechanical expertise, yes, but more importantly, someone she could trust to tell her the truth. Someone who couldn't be bought, bullied, or compromised. Someone with integrity. For Matthew, $10,000 wasn't just money. It was transformation. It was a security deposit on a better apartment. It was winter coats for Emma that didn't come from a thrift store. It was breathing room in a life that had become suffocatingly tight. It was hope, but accepting meant stepping into a world where he didn't belong, taking on responsibilities that seemed far beyond his qualifications. Matthew Shaw was a mechanic who fixed cars with duct tape and ingenuity when parts weren't in the budget. What business did he have consulting for a medical device company? Yet the promise of stability won out. For Emma, for the future he'd promised Sarah he'd build. He said yes. The Ashford Medical Facility in Riverside County was a sprawling complex of steel and concrete, the kind of industrial operation that hummed with purposeful efficiency, at least on the surface. Janet Morrison, the facility manager, greeted Matthew with professional courtesy that barely concealed her resentment. She made it clear that this audit was an unwelcome intrusion, that her facility had passed every inspection, maintained every standard, exceeded every expectation. But Matthew had learned something valuable in his years as a mechanic: the difference between what people showed you and what was actually there. He'd learned to look at the spaces between the official presentation and the messy reality, to notice what people hoped you'd overlook. And there was so much to overlook. The puddle of hydraulic fluid that had been there for days, not hours. The frayed electrical cord wrapped in yellowing tape instead of being properly replaced. The emergency exit blocked by boxes. The expired first aid kit. The broken ventilation fan leaving bathrooms humid and ripe with mold. None of it is catastrophic. All of it damning. But these safety violations, troubling as they were, weren't the real story. The real story emerged in quiet conversations with workers who glanced nervously at management before speaking. Jose in shipping talked about the forklift that randomly lost hydraulic pressure. Maria in assembly described headaches from inadequate ventilation. Kevin in maintenance admitted his team was understaffed and overwhelmed, barely handling emergencies let alone preventive care. And then there was Diana Park, Diana Park was a quality control supervisor in her 30s, precise, thorough professional. She walked Matthew through the testing protocols with the kind of exacting detail that spoke to someone who took her responsibilities seriously. Perhaps too seriously, according to her supervisors. When Matthew asked about rejected components, Diana's carefully controlled composure cracked. Off the record, she told him about insulin pump housings she'd rejected 3 months earlier, components with microfractures that could compromise the seal, putting patients at risk. She'd done her job, marked them for scrap, documented everything. 2 weeks later, she'd seen those same rejected components in the approved shipment pile. Someone had overridden her professional judgment, reclassified defective parts as acceptable, and shipped them to hospitals and clinics where they'd be installed in medical devices that patients trusted with their lives. When Diana reported her concerns, she was told it was a computer error. When she persisted, her performance reviews suddenly criticized her for being overly cautious and hindering production efficiency. The message was clear: be a team player or find another team. Diana had 2 kids and a mortgage. She couldn't afford to be the whistleblower who gets fired. So she stopped pushing. She kept her head down. She did her job within the narrow boundaries she'd been allowed to keep it. And somewhere, patients were using insulin pumps with potentially defective housings, unaware of the risk someone had decided was acceptable. Matthew spent days methodically building his case. The maintenance logs revealed patterns of deferred repairs and ignored work orders. The incident reports documented near misses that should have triggered immediate action. But the quality control records told the most damning story of all. Diana Park had rejected 5 separate batches of components over 6 months. In every single case, her rejection had been overridden within days by Thomas Brennan, the plant manager. In every single case, those rejected components had been shipped to customers within a week. This wasn't occasional corner cutting. This was systematic fraud. Matthew confronted Brennan, a heavy-set man in his 50s with 23 years of manufacturing experience and the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences. Brennan didn't deny the overrides. He justified them. Diana was overly cautious. The components were within acceptable tolerances. Production quotas had to be met. He had the authority and experience to make those calls. When Matthew asked if any of the overridden components had failed in the field, Brennan hesitated, just for a moment, before saying, "Not to my knowledge." But he didn't actually know. He didn't track the components after shipment. He didn't follow up with customers. That wasn't his department. His job was manufacturing efficiency. Patient safety was someone else's problem. The threat Brennan delivered as Matthew left was barely veiled. Keep production numbers up or face financial consequences. It was corporate calculus at its most brutal. Quarterly reports valued over patient safety, profits prioritized over people. Matthew could have written a softer report. He could have documented the safety violations enough to justify his fee, while downplaying the quality control fraud. He could have taken his $10,000 and walked away before things got truly messy, before lawyers got involved, before he became the center of something that might destroy careers and result in criminal charges. It would have been so easy. But Matthew thought about Emma, about the values he was teaching her through his actions. He thought about Sarah and the promise he'd made to stay kind, to stay honest, to build a life that meant something. He thought about Diana Park, terrified of losing everything for doing her job correctly. He thought about patients trusting their lives to medical devices that someone had decided were good enough. He wrote the truth, all 73 pages of it. His report was methodical, comprehensive, and devastating. It documented every safety violation, every deferred maintenance issue, every quality control override. It included photographs, interview transcripts, data analysis showing undeniable patterns. It was a roadmap of institutional failure and a call for immediate action. Victoria Ashford didn't just read the report. She weaponized it. The emergency board meeting was held in downtown offices that made Matthew feel like an imposter. He wore the only suit he owned, bought for his wife's funeral, and stood before executives in expensive clothing with decades of business experience. He was a mechanic from Maple Street about to tell some of the most powerful people in the medical device industry that their operation was fundamentally broken. But when he began presenting his findings, something shifted. The executives became people who needed to hear the truth. Matthew spoke clearly and directly, showing them the evidence, reading excerpts from terrified workers, explaining how systematic failures had created systematic risk. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Victoria didn't hesitate. She proposed immediate action. Thomas Brennan terminated, Janet Morrison suspended pending investigation, voluntary recall of all questionable components, and the creation of a new position, Director of Quality Assurance and Safety Compliance, with full authority to halt production if safety concerns arose. She offered that position to Matthew Shaw. The room erupted. One board member objected. Matthew was a mechanic. They needed someone with credentials, experience in medical device manufacturing. Victoria's response cut through the noise like a blade. What we need is someone with integrity, someone who can't be bullied or bought, someone who will tell us the truth even when it's uncomfortable. The board voted. Victoria's proposals passed unanimously. 3 months later, Matthew stood in the living room of a small house with a yard. Nothing fancy, 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen needing updates, but it was theirs. Emma was already outside planning a spring garden, her laughter carrying through the open windows. Matthew had closed his struggling garage and stepped into a role that still felt surreal. Director Shaw. He'd ensured Diana Park received the promotion and raise she deserved. He'd implemented safety initiatives that prioritized patients over production quotas. He'd proven that doing business ethically wasn't weakness, it was strength. That evening, watching Emma plan where they'd put the doghouse, Matthew thought about the journey from that rainy night when Victoria's car broke down to this moment of hard-won stability. He thought about how one act of simple kindness, helping a stranger without expecting anything in return, had created a cascade of opportunities. But more than that, he thought about how easily he could have compromised. How tempting it would have been to write a softer report, to take the money and run, to prioritize his immediate needs over abstract principles. The path of least resistance had been right there, beckoning. He'd chosen the harder path, and it had changed everything. That night, sitting on his back porch under stars clearer than any he'd seen in the city, Matthew whispered to Sarah's memory, "We're okay. We're going to be okay." For the first time since she died, he believed it completely. Matthew Shaw's story isn't just about one man's redemption or one company's corruption. It's about the choices we face when integrity conflicts with self-interest, when doing the right thing requires personal risk, when speaking truth to power might cost us everything we're trying to protect. In a world that often rewards shortcuts and punishes whistleblowers, Matthew's story reminds us that character isn't what we claim to value. It's what we choose when no one's watching, when the stakes are highest, when compromise would be so much easier. Diana Park did her job correctly and was punished for it. Matthew could have looked the other way and been rewarded handsomely. But both of them understood something fundamental. Some lines shouldn't be crossed, regardless of the cost. Patient safety isn't negotiable. Truth matters. Integrity isn't a luxury for people who can afford it. It's the foundation of a life worth living. Victoria Ashford's role in this story is equally important. She had the power to bury Matthew's findings, to protect her company's reputation and quarterly earnings at the cost of patient safety. Instead, she chose transparency and accountability. She proved that business success and ethical conduct aren't mutually exclusive, that the strongest companies are built on trust, not just profit margins. If the story of courage, integrity, and transformation moved you, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. We share inspiring tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Stories of hope in difficult circumstances, of individuals who choose principle over convenience, of moments when character defines destiny. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our stories about real people facing real challenges with remarkable grace. Because in a world that often feels cynical and transactional, we all need reminders that integrity still matters, that courage still exists, and that one person's choice to do the right thing can create ripples that change everything.